Having spent most of the semester laying out the foundations of our model and defining perfect competition, now we can finally understand what the implications of this model are. So we're going to see how competition maximizes welfare, and we'll use this model to analyze some government policies. It's important to realize that here, when we make any analysis, we're going to be doing this in the context of our model. So any conclusions that we come to are within the confines of our model. So when we say taxes lower welfare, they lower welfare within the confines of the model. And because our models are simplifications of reality, we may not be taking into account all of the benefits that accrue outside of what we have modeled. So that's something to keep in mind when we look at the implications of this particular model. So this model gives you some way to express certain costs and benefits of policies, but we need to be careful when we draw those conclusions to make sure that we are looking at all aspects of the policy that we are analyzing. So the first thing we need in order to get going with our policy analysis is a notion of the producer's welfare. We've already articulated a notion of the consumer's welfare, but we need to be able to articulate what the policy's effects are on producers. So if you remember, the area under the demand curve, but above the price, was what we called the consumer surplus. So if you look at the demand curve and you look at the price, it was the area between the price and the demand curve. And the expenditure was the area below the price up to the quantity. So the interpretation that we had was for the consumer surplus was what you're willing to pay, which is given by the demand curve, minus what you actually pay for the good. For producer surplus, we're going to do something very similar. The producer surplus for the qth good that you sell is what you earn for the qth good, so what you earn by selling it, minus the marginal cost, what it cost you to sell that qth good, given that you were already selling q minus 1 of them. So the total surplus is the area below the price, but above the marginal cost curve. But remember, the marginal cost curve is nothing but the supply curve. So we can articulate this as this producer surplus as the area below the price and above the supply curve. So it's very much the mirror image of the consumer surplus. So let's suppose we had a supply curve that looked like this, or marginal cost curve that looked like this. At each point, it tells us what the cost is to produce one more unit. So the cost of producing the first unit is 1, cost of producing the second unit is 2, third unit is 3, and so forth. So the variable cost of producing 4 units is the area below the marginal cost curve. So if we produce 4 units, our total variable cost is, well, the variable cost for producing the first unit plus the second unit, third unit, fourth unit. So we add those all together to get the total variable cost. You can also think of this as just the integral of the marginal cost. If that is stressful for you, don't worry about it. But remember, if you go back to your calculus classes, you would have seen that the integral is nothing but the area under a curve. So if we take the area under the marginal cost curve, we get the integral of the marginal cost. But if you recall, the marginal cost is nothing but the derivative of the variable cost. So if we take the integral of the marginal cost with respect to quantity, we're taking the integral of the variable cost, the derivative of the variable cost with respect to quantity. Now if you take the integral of the derivative, you just get back the variable cost. Now, what does a firm earn by selling q units at a given price? So if the price is 4 and they sell a quantity of 4, well, they're selling 4 units at the price P, which is 4, so they get P times Q as their revenue. So it's 4 times 4 is 16. So the area of this rectangle would be the revenue. So if we subtract the variable cost from the revenue, we get our producer surplus, which is this area. In general, if you didn't have this step-shaped marginal cost curve and you had a smooth marginal cost curve, it would still be the same idea. You would subtract from this rectangle you would subtract the area under the supply curve. Subtract that area out, and you would be left with the area which represents the producer surplus. Now, how does producer surplus compare to profit? Is it the same thing? Well, it's pretty close, but it's not the same thing. Remember, the area under the marginal cost curve gives us the variable cost, as I just explained. It's the part of the cost that changes with output. Total cost, however, also includes the fixed cost. So these are one-time costs that don't increase with the output. So the total cost is a variable cost plus the fixed cost. So profit is the revenue minus total cost. So it's revenue minus variable cost plus fixed cost. So you could write it as revenue minus variable cost minus fixed cost. But we also know from what we just saw that the producer surplus is revenue minus variable cost. So if your fixed cost were 0, so you didn't have any fixed cost, then profit and producer surplus are exactly the same thing. And in the long run, usually the fixed costs are 0. So producer surplus and profit in the long run are the same thing. In the short run, however, fixed costs might not be 0. So the difference between the producer surplus and the profit is exactly the fixed cost. So another interpretation of the producer surplus is the maximum gains from trade. So what does the producer gain from being able to trade? They've already suffered the fixed cost. So if you said, hey, listen, I'm going to shut down the market, what does the producer have to lose? They've already, remember, at that point, the fixed cost would be a sunk cost. But what does the producer have to gain from being able to participate in the market? That's the producer surplus. So by producing in the short run, by participating in the market, what does the firm get? Well, the firm makes a profit of pi produce, which is revenue minus variable cost minus fixed cost. By shutting down, by exiting the market, the firm suffers a loss of the fixed cost, but that's all. No revenue, no variable cost. So the difference between these two is exactly, so if we subtract from R minus VC minus F, we subtract minus F, we get R minus VC, which is exactly the producer surplus. So the producer surplus then is exactly what we just described, which is the gains from producing rather than not producing. So the gains from participating in the market rather than not.